It's a little torn. Just take the metal ribbon off. Don't make a fuss. Your sister is under a lot of pressure." My mom delivered the words with freezing indifference, not even bothering to look up from her phone at my military dress uniform. My sister had just used a tactical knife to slash a massive, jagged tear across the left chest piece. It was the night before the most important interview of my life at the Pentagon. I had only returned to the family estate for the weekend because my commanding officer strictly ordered me to maintain family appearances during the rigorous background check. Her cowardly jealousy had ripped through the fabric, tearing apart my honor and my 3,200 hours of combat zone service. The next morning, I used safety pins to secure the slashed fabric. I walked into that interview room with my head held high, wearing my shredded dignity. General Vance frowned at the tear. I braced myself. He was preparing to throw me out for disrespecting military regulations, but as his eyes locked onto my name tag, the 4-star general's facial muscles suddenly dropped. He slowly opened his drawer and pulled out a small folded piece of paper he had kept hidden for 14 months. Snorts. His deep voice trembled with disbelief. "Wait, are you that girl? Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are." I stared at the small folded piece of paper, trembling in the general's weathered hand, and my mind violently snapped back 4 years. The freezing air conditioning and oppressive silence of the Pentagon office instantly faded away. It was replaced by the suffocating heavy echo of my dad's voice slamming into my chest. I was no longer a battle-hardened first lieutenant standing in front of a 4-star general. I was 22 years old again, standing on the thick Persian rug in the center of our family estate's grand mahogany study. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and expensive cigar smoke, a sacred space where the family legacy was strictly guarded. Every wall was lined with decades of prestigious military commendations, framed certificates, bronze stars, and unit citations. Not a single one of them bore my name. There was a gap on the south wall between my dad's Distinguished Service Medal and my grandfather's Silver Star where a frame could have hung. It was empty. It had always been empty. It was waiting for my sister. I had just stood up straight, squared my shoulders, and proudly announced my intent to become a frontline combat officer. I expected a nod of approval, a sliver of the respect they showered on my sister every single day. Instead, my dad slammed his heavy calloused hand flat onto the solid oak desk. The sudden impact rattled the glass frames and the shiny brass medals pinned to his own chest. He didn't even bother to stand up to address me. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking at me, not as a daughter, but with a look of pure condescending pity, the kind of look a commander gives to a failing recruit. He let out a long, heavy sigh as if my very existence was a burden to his pristine military career. "You are only fit for logistics support. Your aura was not born to lead," he stated, his voice dripping with absolute finality. Every single word acted as a psychological hammer, designed to crush my self-worth into fine dust. Behind him, my mom stood by the bookshelf with a crystal glass of white wine resting loosely in her manicured fingers. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just gave my dad a slow, satisfied nod, the ghost of a thin smile, tugging at her lips, and took a deliberate sip. That nod confirmed everything. She had orchestrated this conversation, rehearsed his lines, and positioned him as the executioner long before I walked through that door. I stood frozen, the metallic tang of adrenaline pooling in my mouth as I realized the horrifying truth. My parents didn't just overlook me. They were actively suppressing my potential to ensure my sister's fabricated shine would never be challenged by my actual competence. My dad had never once reviewed my physical fitness scores, my marksmanship records, my tactical aptitude evaluations. He had never asked. He already knew I was better. That was the problem. Defeated, I retreated to the hallway, blending into the shadows as a lavish party began in the adjacent living room. I pressed my back against the cold plaster wall and stood in silence, watching my mom parade my sister around the sprawling space for the Officers' Wives Club. The air was choked with the cloying scent of my mom's expensive gardenia perfume, so thick it coated the back of my throat. She poured crystal fluts of champagne, smoothly spinning a completely fictional narrative of my sister, as a strategic prodigy to anyone who would listen. She leaned into the wives of senior colonels and brigadier generals, dropping my dad's name like currency, expertly manipulating the crowd, securing vital political connections, while completely erasing my existence from the family legacy. I watched my sister just stand there in her perfectly tailored designer dress, smiling vacantly, rotating the champagne glass in her hand without ever drinking from it. She was terrified of doing any real work, yet she was absolutely addicted to the unearned applause my mom bought for her. The wives clapped politely whenever my mom finished a fabricated anecdote about my sister's leadership. My sister absorbed it with the blank, practiced gratitude of a beauty pageant contestant who had memorized her thank you speech. Not once did anyone in that room mention my name. That night, the last shred of my desperate craving for their validation permanently died. I completely stopped begging for a seat at a table that was built to exclude me, moving with cold precision in the dead of night. I packed a single olive drab duffel bag with only the bare essentials: a pair of boots, 2 sets of fatigues, a Bible my grandmother had given me before she passed. I enlisted in the military entirely on my own terms, signing the papers without a single family member present, in a fluorescent lit recruiting office that smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee. I deliberately requested deployment to the harshest, most underfunded field hospitals the military operated, eagerly trading their fake aristocratic smiles and champagne galas for the visceral stench of gunpowder iodine and raw survival. While my sister slept on silk sheets in a climate-controlled Georgetown apartment my parents funded, I survived on a basic lieutenant salary, sleeping on thin cots in barracks where the pipes groaned at night and the heating failed every 3rd week. I forged my body and mind into absolute steel discipline. I bought my own dog tags out of my first paycheck, feeling their cold, heavy weight against my chest as I snapped the chain around my neck. Standing in the freezing mud of the base during a brutal morning drill, the wind cutting through my fatigues like a razor, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would never invite them to a single medal ceremony. I would never call home to report a promotion. I would build my own empire right here in the mud, far away from their toxic shadow, and I would never again beg for love from people who had budgeted it entirely for someone else. While I was hauling crates of medical supplies across a freezing tarmac thousands of miles from home, my fingers cracking and raw from the cold back in D.C., my mom was burning through tens of thousands of dollars to construct a flawless illusion. She hired personal military coaches and high-end image consultants for my sister, treating the military like a country club pageant. They staged perfectly lit fake field training photos to shove into my sister's Pentagon file. My sister posed in pristine, unwrinkled camouflage that had never touched actual dirt. The boots were brand new, the laces tied in textbook formation by someone else's hands. She held equipment she couldn't name. She stood on training grounds she had never run. The consultants photoshopped the backgrounds, adjusted the lighting, cropped out anything that looked too comfortable. Years later, when I finally bypassed the system and pulled the raw security logs, the mathematical truth was sickening. My sister's total log time on the actual training ground over 3 entire years was exactly 5 hours and 22 minutes. I had logged over 3,200 hours in a single ward, thousands of miles away from their pathetic charade. I walked into the intensive care unit of the base hospital on a Tuesday morning that smelled like industrial bleach and was colored in the pale green of institutional despair. The air was thick with the sterile biting smell of heavy antiseptics, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, constant hum that never stopped. Not during the day, not during the endless nights. That was where I first saw Emma. She was 7 years old, a frail war orphan, battling severe paralyzing trauma and a rapid, mysterious physical decline that the doctors couldn't fully explain. She weighed barely 50 pounds. Her arms were thin as kindling. Her enormous brown eyes darted to every sound, every movement, every shadow that crossed the doorway of her room. Her mother, Sarah, sat in the corner on a cheap plastic chair, the kind that left red marks on the backs of your thighs. weeping helplessly into her calloused hands, as the rigid, unsympathetic doctors spouted endless streams of cold medical jargon that meant nothing to a woman who had already lost her husband to the same war that was now stealing her daughter. Suddenly, the reinforced windows violently rattled. A massive medical chopper roared directly over the roof of the ward, the heavy thwack 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 of the blades, shaking the very foundation of the building. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles. The water in the plastic cup on Emma's bedside table rippled. The sound triggered an immediate horrific reaction. Emma curled into a tight, terrified ball on her hospital bed, pulling her knees to her chest. Her tiny hands clutched her head so hard her knuckles went white and her eyes blew wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. A strangled animal sound tore from her throat. She was trapped in the auditory nightmare of the very machine that had carried away her dying father. Sarah lunged toward the bed, but her hands were shaking too violently to do anything but hover uselessly over her daughter's convulsing body. I didn't hesitate. I instantly stripped off my rigid, unapproachable officer persona. I dropped my clipboard. It clattered against the linoleum and spun under the bed. I sank down onto my knees on the cold, hard floor, ignoring the sharp ache in my joints, and leaned in close to her. I gently but firmly grabbed her tiny, violently trembling hands, pulling them away from her ears, so she had to lock her panicked eyes directly onto mine amidst the deafening noise. I kept my voice steady, projecting absolute authority and warmth, the same voice I used to calm soldiers who were bleeding out on stretchers. The helicopter isn't bringing fear. It's bringing heroes home. You are a little hero too, and you won't be left behind. The words pierced through her panic like a knife through gauze. Emma stopped thrashing. Her breathing hitched twice, then slowed. She reached out with her small, fragile fingers and gripped my uniform collar like it was a physical lifeline, pulling her out of the dark. She pulled herself toward me, pressing her face against the rough fabric of my chest, and held on with a grip that belied her tiny frame. In that single defining second, she didn't just calm down. She chose me as her protector. Sarah collapsed back into the plastic chair, covering her mouth with both hands, and sobbed with pure, shattered relief. I refused to abandon that post. I stayed by Emma's bedside through grueling double shifts, officially logging 3,200 hours in that specific ward. Over the months that followed, I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair until my lower back screamed, reading to her through the darkest, most agonizing hours of the night. I read her everything. Adventure stories, fairy tales, once at her insistence, the entire maintenance manual for a Black Hawk helicopter, because she said it made the machines less scary if she understood how they worked. Her crayon drawings slowly piled up on the windowsill, each one a small sunrise over the concrete helipad, each one drawn with a hand that trembled a little more than the day before. The colors grew fainter as her grip weakened. The lines grew shakier, but every single morning, despite the excruciating pain eating away at her fragile body, Emma would force herself to sit up in her bed. She would look out the reinforced glass window toward the concrete helipad point, her weak finger at the breaking dawn, and whisper to me with a fierce, unbelievable resilience, "The sun is up again, Madison. I'm still fighting." As the grueling months dragged on, the reality of the ward became bleak. Emma's small body began to fail her entirely, her energy sapped by the relentless illness. Her walks to the window became shuffles, then stopped altogether. I moved the chair so she could see the helipad without sitting up. Throughout it all, I never missed a single shift, refusing to leave her alone for even a minute of her decline. Sergeant First Class David Miller, a hardened NCO who had seen his fair share of tragedy and rarely showed emotion beyond a tightened jaw, stood silently by my side, throughout carefully documenting my unwavering presence with rigid, obsessive precision. Over those agonizing months, he officially filed 38 unarguable, rock-solid field reports directly into the military's secure database. Each report ended with the exact same undeniable truth: the mental state of pediatric patient E. Hayes and her relative is maintained stable, thanks to the presence and excellent psychological intervention of First Lieutenant M. Adams, 0.38 times. The same conclusion, the same officer's name, mine. Over a year later, as the bitter autumn chill set in, and the ward windows fogged with condensation. Every morning, the fight finally left her. Emma was fading rapidly, her breathing shallow, and labored the monitors beside her bed, beeping in slower and slower intervals. Just days before she closed her eyes forever, in a moment of stunning clarity that the doctors couldn't explain, she forced her mother, Sarah, to sit by the bed with a pen and paper. Her eyes were bright and urgent, burning with a focus that hadn't been there in weeks. With her last ounces of strength, Emma dictated a letter explicitly addressing it to the generals who choose leaders. She poured her tiny, brave soul into those words, telling them about the officer who knelt on the floor and held her hands when the helicopters came. Then she reached for one last piece of paper. Her fingers could barely grip the crayon, but she pressed it hard against the sheet and drew a final sunrise over the helipad. The lines shaky and uneven, the bright oranges and yellows bleeding wildly outside the borders. She snorts, flipped the paper over, and scratched out 5 words in her broken, trembling handwriting. Then she placed her small hand into mine, squeezing my fingers with the last of her strength, and I felt every ounce of trust she had left in this world transfer through that grip. Emma died a soldier's death fighting until the very last second. A week later, I stood at her military funeral in my crisp, immaculately pressed dress uniform. The air was suffocatingly silent, heavy, with the kind of profound loss that sits on your chest like a stone and refuses to move. I raised my hand in a rigid, perfect salute toward her tiny wooden casket, draped in a small American flag that a sergeant had folded with trembling hands. I stood perfectly still, while my heart shattered into a million irreparable pieces inside my chest. Sarah stood across from me, gripping the folded flag they placed in her arms, and our eyes met over the casket. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. Several weeks after the funeral, the Pentagon hosted a massive high-profile tribute gala for fallen soldiers and their families. The ballroom was a sea of glittering medals, dress uniforms, and aristocratic chatter. I stood on the far side of the room near the service entrance, watching from a distance as Sarah navigated through the crowd. She approached Colonel Susan Wright, the chief medical officer, who had overseen Emma's care. I couldn't hear the words from where I stood, but I could read every tremor in Sarah's hands, every silent plea carved into the deep lines of her exhausted face, as she held out the tightly folded letter. The colonel's expression shifted from polite professional attention to something deeper. Her lips parted slightly. Her hand came up to her chest. She took the letter carefully as if it were made of glass, and I watched her walk across the entire length of the ballroom, past the champagne tables and the generals' wives, and pass it directly into the hands of General Thomas Vance. He unfolded it, read the first 3 lines, and his face went completely still. "Please give this to the people who have the power to decide Madison's future." I learned later that those were the exact words Sarah had spoken to the colonel, her voice thick with grief, but completely resolute. Yet in that very same glittering ballroom, a secondary, far more sinister transaction occurred. Snort Sarah, desperate to ensure I received every piece of Emma's legacy, located my mom among the crowd of officers' wives. She approached her reverently, holding the crude crayon drawing of the bright sunrise over the concrete helipad, Emma's absolute last personal gift to me. My mom looked down at the grieving widow from her full height, flashed a perfectly practiced, fake, benevolent smile, and promised to deliver the drawing safely. She placed her manicured hand over Sarah's callous one and squeezed it with rehearsed compassion. But the absolute second Sarah turned her back and vanished into the crowd, my mom's smile dropped into a cold sneer. She glanced at the drawing, the crude childish lines and the bleeding crayon colors, and her lip curled. She snorts, folded the paper, carelessly, shoved it into her designer clutch bag, drove back to our sprawling estate that night, and tossed it into the dark, suffocating abyss of her personal antique drawer, buried beneath imported silk scarves and velvet jewelry boxes. She buried a dead child's final wish beneath her vanity, just to ensure I never felt a shred of victory. A few agonizing months after the funeral, I was still completely drowning in my own grief. Operating on autopilot, I sat alone in my cramped, dimly lit barracks room after another 18-hour shift that had blurred into the one before it. The room was barely 10 feet across. A metal frame caught a footlocker, a desk bolted to the wall, and a single overhead light that flickered when the wind hit the building a certain way. I hadn't called anyone in weeks. I hadn't eaten a full meal in days. The grief sat inside my chest like a physical object, something with weight and edges that pressed against my ribs every time I breathed. Seeking a quiet release for the immense pressure building in my chest, I opened our shared family cloud server on my heavily encrypted military laptop. The blue login screen glowed in the darkness of the room. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I poured my absolute soul into a deeply personal, unauthorized memoir. I wrote endlessly about Emma's fragile courage, about the way her tiny fingers gripped the crayon so hard her knuckles turned white. I wrote about Sarah's quiet resilience, the way she sat in that cheap plastic chair night after night, without ever complaining, without ever asking why. I wrote about those heartbreaking sunrises we watched over the helipad, the way Emma's voice would crack on the word fighting. But she would say it anyway every single morning, until she couldn't say it anymore. It wasn't a standard military briefing. It was raw, bleeding text, torn straight from my trauma pages, and pages of unfiltered agony that I had never spoken aloud to another living person. I saved the document deep within a subfolder, naively thinking it would remain a private digital diary, a digital tombstone for my little hero. Exhausted, I slammed the laptop shut, pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw white sparks, and went back out into the freezing mud of the base. I was entirely unaware that I had just handed my enemies the weapon they needed. Barely a few days later, in the dead of the night, my mom sat in the glow of her pristine home office. The room was immaculate. White lacquered bookshelves, a crystal paperweight, fresh flowers in a porcelain vase that the housekeeper replaced every Monday. While I was pulling another grueling overnight shift at the hospital, monitoring a post-surgical patient whose vitals kept dipping every 40 minutes, my mom logged directly into the family cloud server from her desktop. She methodically clicked through my private files subfolder by subfolder, with the practiced patience of someone who had been surveilling her own children's digital footprints for years. She found the memoir. She opened it. She read through my agony, my sleepless nights, and the profound tragedy of Emma's death, scrolling slowly through every paragraph. But she didn't feel an ounce of maternal sympathy. Her reading glasses reflected the blue light of the screen. Her expression never changed. Instead, her cold, calculating eyes saw nothing but a golden ticket for the daughter she had actually invested in. She instantly grabbed her phone from the charging pad and fired an urgent text to my dad. I just read Madison's report on the system. The story about the child named Emma is extremely valuable. Chloe's profile is too weak. Her grades are low. We have to take it for Chloe. My dad, sitting across the country in his own home office at the Pentagon staff quarters, stared at the glowing text message. The timestamp read, just past midnight. For a brief, pathetic second, his buried conscience flared up. He weakly protested through the encrypted military chat app, his fingers trembling as he typed his objection. That is Madison's hard work, Eleanor. But my mom, a master of psychological dominance, who had spent 30 years bending Pentagon wives, defense contractors, and senior officers to her, will crush his fragile morality instantly. Her ambition was absolute and ruthless, sharpened to a lethal edge by decades of climbing the military social ladder. She fired back a response that laid bare the entire toxic foundation of our family. Madison is just a logistics worker. Chloe is the future of this family. This is what we must do to push her to the general rank. My dad stared at his phone for a long moment. The cursor blinked on the reply field. He could have typed a refusal. He could have called me. He could have reported the breach to the base security officer. Instead, he locked the screen, set the phone face down on his desk, and said nothing. His silence was his signature on the theft. My sister didn't hesitate to become a thief. Within 48 hours, she had dragged my file onto her personal desktop and copied my blood-soaked words verbatim. She stripped away my name from the header, erased every mention of First Lieutenant M. Adams, and slapped her own name across the top of the document, She submitted my fractured soul, my 3D 200 hours, my sleepless nights with a dying child, as her own deeply moving personal essay for the Pentagon's highly coveted Senior Strategic Leadership Scholarship. The review board, moved by the profound tale of sacrifice and empathy, gave my sister the silent nod for the coveted seat. She stole the absolute pinnacle of my military glory, securing her rapid ascent to power without ever shedding a single drop of sweat. Completely convinced that the logistics peasant, grinding away in the dirt, thousands of miles away, would never find out. My mind violently snapped back to the present moment, tearing me away from the ghosts of the ward. The freezing, aggressive air conditioning of the Pentagon office blasted against my face, sharpening every nerve ending in my body like a slap of cold water. General Vance was still standing across from the heavy mahogany desk, carefully holding Emma's handwritten letter in his weathered hands. His sharp eyes darted from the shredded, pinned-up fabric of my uniform, down to the trembling piece of paper and back to my face. The silence in the room pressed down like a concrete slab. The clock on the wall behind him ticked once, twice, 3 times. Neither of us moved. I watched his jaw tighten as the pieces assembled behind his eyes. The deeply moving, highly praised essay my sister had submitted, the one that had won her the coveted scholarship seat, the one that had made the entire review board lean forward in their chairs with admiration, matched the raw, childish handwriting of the little girl's letter with surgical precision. The same names, the same locations, the same heartbreaking sunrises over the same concrete helipad, the same ward, the same helicopter roars, the same dying child. But the horrific truth was glaringly obvious. The little girl's dying letter was addressed directly, unmistakably to me. Not to Second Lieutenant Chloe Adams, to First Lieutenant Madison Adams. The woman standing in front of him with a shredded uniform and safety pins holding her dignity together. The realization hit me with the kinetic force of a sniper's bullet, shattering every remaining misconception I had left about my family. A few weeks ago, due to a sudden, unforeseen personnel shift at the Pentagon, Major Rachel Collins had forcefully intervened and made me submit a late expedited application for the exact same scholarship. When the official call came in ordering me to this interview, my sister had gone into a rabid, uncontrollable panic back at the family estate. She had screamed at my mom for over an hour, pacing the living room, knocking a crystal vase off the mantelpiece. At the time, I thought it was just her usual, fragile ego cracking under the pressure of competition. But now, standing the fluorescent lights, with the general's letter trembling between us, the puzzle pieces violently clicked into place. She knew that the absolute second I walked into this room and spoke to the board about Emma, about the ward, about the sunrises, her plagiarized essay would be exposed instantly. That was exactly why she took a tactical knife to my dress uniform the night before. As I stood at attention in the general's office, the cold metal of the safety pin dug sharply into my chest, a physical biting reminder of her absolute treason. She wasn't just throwing a childish tantrum in the living room. It was a highly calculated, cowardly strike designed to completely eliminate me from the battlefield. She wanted me to back out in deep shame, or better yet, get thrown out of this very office and court, marshaled for severe uniform code violations, before I could ever utter a single word about my time at the hospital. Her violent desperation wasn't born of jealousy. It was born of sheer paralyzing terror that the logistics peasant was about to burn down her stolen throne. My jaw locked. My nerves ground together so hard I could hear them creak inside my own skull. My spine straightened to a perfect line vertebrae by vertebrae, as if someone was pulling a steel cable through my core. I activated the tactical breathing I had drilled into muscle memory across a 100 and combat exercises. 4 counts in through the nose. 4 counts hold, feeling my diaphragm press against my belt. 4 counts out through the mouth. The anger didn't dissolve. It crystallized. It went from hot and blind to cold and precise like liquid nitrogen poured over a blade. Every remaining ounce of familiar love duty or obligation I had left inside my body instantly incinerated. It didn't burn away gradually. It didn't flicker and fade. It combusted in a single violent flash, and the ashes settled into something permanent, something lethal. The word mom died in my vocabulary. The word dad followed it. The word sister became a tactical designation for a hostile target. The enemy wasn't an ocean away in a foreign combat zone. The enemy was sleeping comfortably in my childhood home, eating at my dinner table, wearing my blood and tears like a designer dress. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the sharp pain of the safety pins digging into my skin. I looked General Vance dead in the eye, adjusted my posture to a flawless position of attention, and silently declared a total unyielding war against my own bloodline. The general saw it happen. He saw the shift behind my eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. He had seen soldiers cross that line before the moment when restraint becomes strategy and grief becomes ammunition. If you've ever had your hard work stolen by someone who was supposed to love you, hit the like button right now and share in the comments below what was the exact moment you realized you had to stop playing the victim and start fighting back. The absolute second I stepped out of the Pentagon building, my boots hitting the concrete steps outside, I shifted entirely into a combat mindset. Every civilian emotion, every ounce of hurt, every whisper of sisterly affection that had somehow survived the last 4 years, all of it was locked into a steel box inside my chest, and the key was thrown away. I marched straight back to the base and stormed into Major Rachel Collins' office, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind me, hard enough to rattle the framed commendations on her wall. She was sitting behind her cluttered desk, a half-eaten sandwich pushed aside, coffee going cold beside a stack of classified personnel files. She looked up and read my face in 1 second flat. I bypassed all standard protocol and demanded she use her clearance to pull the raw hospital security logs from the base medical facility. Major Rachel didn't ask a single unnecessary question. She didn't ask what happened at the Pentagon. She didn't ask why my uniform was torn. She turned to her terminal, punched in her access codes with the practiced speed of a woman who had been running base operations for 15 years, and the data came back razor sharp and utterly undeniable. My 200 hours of grueling logged service stacked against my sister's pathetic 5 hours and 22 minutes. The digital records proved my sister hadn't spent a single second anywhere near Emma's ward. Not 1 minute, not one visit, not one word spoken to the child whose story she had stolen and submitted as her own. Major Rachel leaned forward aggressively, tapping her indexed fingers on the printed stack of security logs. Her voice dropped into a lethal commanding growl, enough to send her to a court-martial. Use it like a bomb. I took the printed logs, folded them precisely into thirds, and slipped them into my jacket pocket next to my chest. Then I pulled out my phone and called my mom. I sat in Major Rachel's office, backed straight against the wall, feet flat on the floor, controlling every muscle in my body down to my breathing rate. I kept my voice dead calm, flat as a frozen lake, perfectly regulating my breathing to set a flawless psychological snare. When she answered with her usual haughty tone, already launching into a rehearsed lecture about my attitude and my ungrateful behavior at the family estate, I cut her off immediately with 5 words delivered in the same voice. I used to issue orders under fire. Mom, did Chloe's essay submitted to the Pentagon mention Emma Hayes? I didn't blink. I just listened. 5 agonizing seconds of absolute suffocating dead silence followed. The line was so quiet. I could hear the faint static of the connection and the distant hum of her refrigerator. Her slick, rapid-fire politician's tongue, the same tongue that had manipulated Pentagon wives, colonels, defense lobbyists, and senators' aides for 3 decades, was completely paralyzed by the sheer unexpected precision of the strike. I could hear her breathing change through the phone speaker, short, shallow, panicked inhales. She realized in that exact moment that the fortress of lies they had built was completely compromised. She finally stammered, her voice shaking violently with unfiltered terror. What? What are you talking about? She didn't ask who Emma was. She didn't ask what essay I meant. She didn't say, I don't understand. She absolutely knew. The question itself was a confession. Her guilty silence had already admitted everything her words tried to deny. I hung up the phone immediately, cutting the connection with a sharp click. Major Rachel watched from across the desk, a thin, approving line forming on her lips. She didn't say a word. She just nodded once. the kind of nod that said, "Now finish it." I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I sat at my desk in the barracks, illuminated only by the harsh blue glare of my laptop, and spent the entire night drafting a ruthlessly detailed 15-page formal grievance to the Pentagon Disciplinary Board. I laid out every single piece of undeniable digital evidence in chronological order: the security logs, the file access timestamps from the family cloud server showing my mom's login at midnight, the metadata proving my memoir was created months before my sister's plagiarized submission. I cross-referenced the 38 field reports Miller had filed, linking each one to the exact ward, the exact patient, the exact hours that my sister's essay claimed as her own experience. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the barracks window, the document was airtight. No gaps, no assumptions, no emotions. Pure evidence assembled with the cold efficiency of a military intelligence brief. I encrypted the file, attached it to a secure military channel, and fired it straight into the Pentagon's internal affairs pipeline. Then I closed the laptop, laced up my boots, and went for a 5 meter run in the cold. My body needed the exhaustion. My mind needed the silence. 2 days after the grievance was officially filed, and the shockwaves began to quietly ripple through the upper brass, my dad desperately begged for a secret meeting. He sent the request through 3 different channels, each one more pathetic than the last. A text I didn't answer, a voicemail I didn't listen to. Finally, a handwritten note slipped under my barracks door by a junior aide he had bribed with a bottle of scotch. I chose a grimy off-base diner on a county road 12 miles from the installation. The kind of place where truckers ate breakfast at 4 in the morning and nobody asked questions. When I walked in, he was sitting in the back booth, hunched over a cup of black coffee that he hadn't touched. The surface had gone cold and filmy. He looked utterly destroyed. His uniform was wrinkled, the creases gone from his trousers for the first time in my entire life. Dark circles cut deep beneath his eyes, like someone had pressed their thumbs into clay. His hands wouldn't stop moving, turning the coffee cup in slow, aimless circles on the sticky Formica's surface, the ceramic scraping quietly against the countertop. The man who had once slammed his fist on an oak desk and declared me unfit to lead couldn't even hold his own gaze in the reflection of the window. He slid a heavy encrypted military USB drive across the table. Its snorts landed with a dull metallic clink against the sugar dispenser on my side of the booth. He refused to meet my eyes as his voice cracked. "I am not asking for your forgiveness, Madison. I just want you to know that I was wrong to let your mother cross the line. The military has no place for plagiarists." I picked up the USB drive without a word. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling its weight. The cold metal casing, the small engraved serial number on the back. I knew exactly what it contained. The 52 decrypted text messages between my parents that proved the premeditated theft of my memoir, my trauma, my 200 hours. And Emma's legacy, every message timestamped, every order from my mom to steal, every weak, cowardly compliance from the man sitting across from me, his silence documented in the gaps between her commands and his eventual agreement. I pocketed the drive and stood up. I looked down at the broken colonel, the father who had chosen his wife's ambition over his daughter's blood. The man who had watched his wife parade a fraud for years and chosen his own comfort over the truth. He sat there with his shoulders caved in, staring at his cold coffee, waiting for something: absolution, a touch of mercy, a flicker of the daughter who had once begged for his approval. "Thank you, Colonel, for your cooperation, but this truth will not salvage your cowardice." I turned my back on him and walked out of the diner. The bell above the door chimed once as it shut behind me. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to my truck. I didn't look back. Not through the window, not through the rearview mirror, not once. Barely 3 days after I filed the grievance, my mom aggressively summoned me back to the family estate. She left a voicemail on my phone that dripped with the same icy authority she had wielded over Pentagon dinner tables for 30 years, fully intending to use her usual toxic dominance to bully me into dropping the charges. She expected the quiet, obedient logistics worker to show up, the same girl who had packed her duffel bag in the dark and left without a fight 4 years ago. She had already rehearsed her script. I could hear it in the cadence of her voicemail, the perfectly timed pauses, the slight crack of manufactured emotion. She was going to cry. She was going to invoke family. She was going to remind me of the sacrifices she'd made. She was going to make me feel like the villain. I sat in my truck in the circular driveway for 60 seconds before entering. The engine ticked as it cooled. I pulled the USB drive from my jacket pocket and confirmed the files were synced to Major Rachel's secure server as a backup. If anything happened to the original, if my mom somehow got her hands on it, if my sister smashed the drive, the data was already mirrored in 3 separate locations that none of them could access. I counted 4 tactical breaths. I scanned the windows of the house, 2 lights on downstairs, the master suite dark. My sister's car was parked crookedly in front of the garage, 1 tire on the grass. She had arrived in a panic. Good, then I stepped out. I didn't bother knocking. I threw open the heavy mahogany front doors, and the loud slam echoed through the pristine foyer, bouncing off the marble floor and the crystal chandelier above. I completely ignored my sister's pathetic fake crying in the living room. The same rehearsed sobbing she had deployed every time she wanted my parents to fight her battles for her since she was 6 years old. Her mascara was already stray. A box of tissues sat on the arm of the sofa. The performance had been running for a while. I blew right past my mom's glaring, furious eyes as she stepped into the foyer and demanded to know what I was doing in her house. Her voice was sharp, imperious, loaded with the expectation that I would stop, turn around, and submit. I didn't utter a single word to either of them. I marched straight past the sweeping staircase and headed directly for the master suite on the 2nd floor. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, executing the raid with flawless military precision. I tore into my mom's expansive bedroom, ignoring her frantic footsteps, rushing up the stairs behind me, her heels slipping twice on the hardwood. I went straight for her massive antique dresser, the place she hid all her most guarded, filthy secrets. The place where family scandals, forged recommendation letters, and inconvenient truths went to disappear. I ripped open the bottom drawer, aggressively tossing aside expensive imported silk scarves and velvet jewelry boxes that clattered onto the hardwood floor. And there it was. Pushed all the way to the back, crushed beneath the weight of her vanity, lay a crumpled, frayed piece of drawing paper. I carefully pulled it out. My fingers recognized the texture before my eyes confirmed it. The rough grain of the cheap drawing paper they stocked in the hospital ward, the faded wax of the crayons Emma had pressed so hard against the sheet that they left grooves in the paper. It was Emma's crude crayon drawing of the sunrise over the helipad. The bright oranges and yellows had faded from months of being buried in the dark, but the shapes were unmistakable. The big circle of the sun, the flat rectangle of the helipad, the tiny stick figure with a triangle skirt standing next to a taller stick figure in a uniform. My hands trembled as I gently flipped the paper over. The shaky, uneven handwriting of a dying child carved a massive, aching hole straight through my chest. To Madison, my protector. Emma, 5 words. 5 words that a 7-year-old girl had pressed into the paper with the last strength in her tiny fingers. 5 words that my mom had accepted from a grieving widow with a fake smile. Promised to deliver, and then buried in a drawer like a piece of junk mail, beneath her imported silk scarves. I pressed the drawing against my chest, feeling the paper crinkle against the torn fabric of my uniform, and I held it there for 3 full seconds. Then I folded it, carefully, slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and turned toward the door. My mom was standing in the doorway, blocking my path. Her face flushed and livid, her chest heaving. I walked straight at her, and she stepped aside. She had no choice. The look in my eyes was not the look of a daughter. It was the look of a soldier advancing on a position. I tightly gripped the drawing inside my pocket and walked back down the grand staircase, my boots stomping heavily on the hardwood floor. Each snort's step echoed like a countdown. My mom and my sister were waiting in the formal dining room, their faces pale with shock. My mom had positioned herself at the head of the massive reinforced glass dining table, arms crossed, chin raised high, still clinging to the delusion that she could command this room and everyone in it. My sister stood behind her using our mom as a human shield mascara, streaking down her face in dark rivers. Her fingers gripping the back of a dining chair so hard, her knuckles were bone white. I didn't stop moving until I reached the center of the room. I pulled the drawing from my pocket, unfolded it with deliberate slowness so they could both see exactly what I was holding, and I slammed it face up onto the massive reinforced glass dining table. The deafening sharp crack of the impact echoed through the room, making them both jump out of their skin. The chandelier above swayed slightly from the vibration. I locked my eyes directly onto my mom entirely, stripping away any remaining facade of familial respect. My voice was laced with pure, unadulterated venom, every syllable enunciated with the precision of a military tribunal pronouncement. This painting, the final relic of a deceased child, was given to you on the day of the tribute gala. It was meant for me, and you hid it at the bottom of your drawer to protect this golden child's rotten facade. My mom's composure shattered for exactly 1 second. Her eyes flicked to the drawing, then to my sister, then back to me. Her nostrils flared. She lunged across the glass table to snatch the paper away from me, her manicured nails scraping against the glass surface, but I violently pinned it down with my fist, daring her to try and move me. My knuckles turned white against the glass. The veins in my forearms stood out like cables. She pulled back her fingers, shaking, realizing for the first time in her life that she could not physically overpower me. My sister backed away from the table, pressing herself against the dining room wall as she began rapidly hyperventilating in sheer terror. Her back hit the wainscoting. She slid down an inch, then caught herself. She choked on her own tears, stammering out a pathetic plea, her voice cracking on every other word. "You can't do this. My career will be ruined." I straightened my posture to full attention, towering over the both of them, feeling the safety pins in my torn uniform glinting under the chandelier light. I delivered the final tactical strike with freezing absolute certainty, counting each piece of evidence on my fingers as I spoke. I have the original draft. I have the base security logs. I have 52 text messages from our parents, and now I have this painting. Your doomsday has arrived, Second Lieutenant. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door. I didn't slam it behind me this time. I left it wide open, letting the cold night air flood into their pristine, temperature-controlled world. I walked to my truck, started the engine, and drove away with the drawing resting safely against my chest next to the dog tags I had bought for myself 4 years ago. Behind me, through the open front door, the lights of the family estate blazed like a building on fire. I didn't look back. When the morning of the historic tribunal finally arrived, the sprawling Pentagon hearing room felt like a freezing, sterile execution chamber. The fluorescent lights overhead were unforgiving, washing every face in the room in a cold, clinical white that hid nothing. I walked in with my head held incredibly high, taking the witness stand while still deliberately wearing the torn dress uniform, the jagged fabric held aggressively together by the cold metal safety pins. I had been offered a replacement jacket by 2 separate officers before the hearing. I refused both times. Every general on the 5-member board stared at the tier. They understood the message without a single word of explanation. Across from me, my sister sat shrinking into her heavy oak chair behind the defense table, visibly trembling. Her designer blazer couldn't hide the way her shoulders were folded inward as if her body was trying to make itself disappear. She was flanked by Marcus Thorne, an obscenely expensive elite military defense lawyer hired by my mom to try and salvage the unsalvageable. Thorne looked smug, adjusting his gold cufflinks, confident he could bully a logistics officer into stammering contradictions on the stand. But I didn't give him a single second to breathe or establish dominance in that room. Before he could even open his mouth for an opening statement, before he could deploy his rehearsed strategy of casting doubt and confusion, I bypassed the standard pleasantries and immediately fired up the massive digital projector mounted in the center of the chamber. I flooded the massive glowing screen with the undeniable hospital security logs. My 200 hours of blood and mud visually crushing my sister's pathetic 5 hours and 22 minutes into complete irrelevance. The sheer disparity made the generals in the room physically shift in their seats. leather creaking as they leaned forward to read the numbers again. One of them removed his glasses and put them back on. Then I bypassed Thorne's sputtering protests entirely and displayed the 52 decrypted, highly incriminating text messages between my parents, each one time-stamped and verified by the military's own encryption protocols. Every order from my mom to steal my file, every pathetic, cowardly compliance from my dad. Every mention of Emma's name used not as a tribute, but as raw material for theft. Thorne desperately tried to stammer out a frantic objection, wildly waving his hands and rambling about creative inspiration and coincidental overlapping experiences and collaborative family projects. His voice climbed higher with each rebuttal, losing its courtroom polish and descending into the panicked improvisation of a man whose entire case was being demolished in real time. I silenced his pathetic legal maneuvering completely by establishing a secure live high-definition video link directly to the military base. The screen flickered once, and then Sarah Hayes's face appeared on the giant projector screen, her image 10 feet tall, silencing the entire room instantly. Sarah's voice echoed powerfully through the cavernous chamber, vibrating with a potent mixture of unyielding grief and pure righteous rage. She didn't flinch under the stare of the 4-star generals. She sat in the same small, quiet room where Emma had drawn her sunrises, the windowsill still cluttered with faded crayon drawings. And she looked directly into the camera with the unshakable conviction of a mother who had buried her only child and had nothing left to fear. My daughter's dying wish, a child who was a victim of war, was meant solely for First Lieutenant Madison. My daughter died believing that Madison had received the sunrise painting, but Lady Eleanor heartlessly stole it. The absolute conviction in her voice struck the room like a physical blow. Thorne sank back into his leather chair, his hands dropping to his sides. My sister's hyperventilation became audible across the entire chamber, a rapid wheezing gasp that the court stenographer paused to acknowledge. General Vance, sitting at the center of the long mahogany table, slowly stood up from his chair. The room went dead silent. He held up the physical crumpled crayon painting of the sunrise, right alongside Emma's original handwritten letter, one in each hand, the dying child's words in one fist, and her final drawing in the other. The board members leaned forward, their eyes moving between the painting and my sister's face, staring at her in absolute, unfiltered disgust. The facade of the brilliant golden child was completely ripped away, leaving only a cowardly plagiarist exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of military justice. My sister's head dropped forward. She couldn't look at anyone. Thorne reached for her arm and she flinched away from his touch. Through the thick, soundproof glass doors at the back of the chamber, I saw my mom charging down the hallway like a cornered animal, fully intending to pound on the glass and illegally interrupt the federal hearing. Her heels clacked violently against the polished marble floor, each strike echoing like a gunshot. Her face was twisted with fury and desperation. Every ounce of her carefully constructed public image completely abandoned her hair loose. Her composure shattered. But before she could reach the doors, my dad intercepted her. He stepped into her path and seized her arm with the force of a commanding officer issuing a final order. "Don't you have ruined enough?" His shout echoed even through the thick glass, the sound muffled but unmistakable, officially breaking her tyrannical hold over the family. She staggered sideways, staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, her mouth open and wordless. For the first time in 30 years of marriage, her husband had refused her command. For the first time in my entire life, my dad had chosen the truth over her ambition. He held her there, his grip unyielding, until the security guards arrived and escorted them both away from the hearing room doors. I turned back to General Vance. The room was still. Every eye was on me. I could hear the hum of the projector, the low whir of the ventilation system, and nothing else. My voice echoed clearly across the silent chamber, steady, controlled, and resonant. I stand here not to exact revenge on my family. I stand here to protect the honor of a true soldier, to reclaim a voice for little Emma's soul. Fakery can never buy a command position using the blood and tears of others. General Vance brought his gavel down once. The sound cracked through the chamber with absolute finality. and the reverberations hung in the air long after the wood had stopped moving. The verdict handed down by the board was swift and utterly merciless. The board immediately recommended my sister for a general court-martial, resulting in a permanent dismissal from the military, forever barring her from any position of federal authority. The highly fabricated future general was permanently reduced to a disgraced, powerless civilian. Her name was entered into the federal misconduct database. Every door she had ever walked through on my mother's arm slammed shut permanently. The untouchable Addams family empire fractured completely under the immense weight of the scandal. My parents filed for legal separation within weeks. The pressure of public humiliation, mutual blame, and a Pentagon investigation tearing apart the partnership that had held their fraud together for decades. When my mom frantically bombarded my phone with toxic, desperate messages, blaming me for her own downfall, calling me ungrateful, calling me a traitor to the family name, accusing me of destroying everything she had built, I didn't bother to type out a reply. I held the phone in my hand for a long, quiet moment. I read the last message, 12 exclamation points, 3 threats, 1 mention of God that she had no right to invoke. Then I pressed the button to permanently block her number. The screen went dark. The contact vanished. I set the phone down on the table face up and stared at the blank screen for 5 seconds. Then I walked away from the table, fully content to let their own lies burn their aristocratic lives to the ground. Several months after the suffocating dust of the scandal finally settled, the Pentagon formally granted me the prestigious Strategic Leadership Scholarship, officially restoring the honor that was stolen from me. My name was placed where it should have been all along, at the top of the file, attached to my own words, my own 200 hours, my own blood. But before I packed my heavy olive-drab duffel bags to permanently relocate to Washington, D.C., I drove my truck back to the military base to see Sarah one last time. The drive took 4 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in silence, watching the flat open road stretch out ahead of me through the windshield, thinking about a 7-year-old girl who had pointed at the sunrise every morning and refused to stop fighting. I walked into Sarah's small, quiet living room, bathed in the soft afternoon sunlight that came through the west-facing window, the same window Emma used to look through at the helipad from her hospital bed, just 2 buildings away. Sarah Snorts didn't offer a stiff formal greeting. She didn't shake my hand. She immediately pulled me into a crushing, desperate hug, a hug holding infinitely more genuine warmth and love than my biological family had offered me unto me in 26 years. Her arms locked around my back, and she held on like she was afraid I would disappear. I felt her shoulders shake against mine. I held on too. We stood like that for a long time. Neither of us saying a word, the afternoon light pooling golden on the floor around our feet. When she finally let go, Sarah pulled out a small, worn wooden sewing kit from her side table. The lid was scratched, and the hinges were brass darkened with age. She gently asked me to take off the slashed, heavily decorated dress uniform jacket. I unbuttoned it slowly, 1 brass button at a time, and handed it to her. She laid it across her lap with the same care she would give a wounded child, smoothing the fabric with her palms, tracing the edge of the tear with her fingertip. With incredibly slow, steady hands, she carefully removed the cold, sharp metal safety pins that my sister's violent jealousy had forced me to wear like a badge of shame for months. One by one, she pulled them free, each pin leaving behind a tiny hole in the dark wool. She set each pin on the side table with a soft click. 4 pins, 4 small acts of removal, 4 months of humiliation undone in 60 seconds. She carefully aligned the torn edges of the heavy wool fabric, making sure they matched perfectly, pressing the fibers together with her thumb and forefinger, as if she were mending a wound in living skin. Then she threaded a thin needle with a spool of bright, shimmering gold thread and began steadily stitching the jagged, horrific tear together, right over where my heart rested. Each stitch was small, precise, and deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. The only sound in the room was the soft whisper of the gold thread, pulling through the dark fabric and the ticking of the clock on the wall. In the exact center of the heavy golden repair, Right where the knife had pierced deepest, Sarah masterfully embroidered a flawless, delicate letter E. She tied off the knot, snipped the thread with a pair of small scissors, and looked up at me. She smiled softly, warm tears shimmering heavily in her eyes as she lifted the jacket with both hands and held it out. Now Emma will always be the shield protecting you from the most cruel blades. I put the heavy jacket back on, buttoning it slowly, feeling the thick golden embroidery resting perfectly against my chest. The agonizing wound my sister had maliciously inflicted was entirely gone, beautifully replaced by an unbreakable, loving shield, stitched by the hands of a mother who understood loss and love, and the fierce, quiet strength it takes to survive both. I ran my fingers over the raised letter E, feeling the texture of the gold thread against the dark wool. It was warm. It was permanent. It was armor. I walked out to my truck and placed my duffel bag in the bed. Emma's sunrise painting, carefully protected between two sheets of cardboard, was waiting to be framed on my brand new desk at the Pentagon. A permanent reminder that the dawn always breaks for those who fight in the dark. I started the engine and pulled out of the base parking lot. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and wide open, cutting straight through flat country toward the capital. I pressed the gas and drove toward Washington. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Not once. If you believe that true family isn't about blood, but about who stands by your side in the darkest trenches, hit that like button and subscribe right now. I want to hear your story. Who is the Emma or Sarah in your life that helped you heal your deepest wounds? Let me know in the comments.